Good evening. My name is Rachel Urim, and I serve as president of AJC Cleveland. On behalf of our partners, the Jewish Federation of Cleveland and the Maltz Museum of Jewish Heritage, it is my distinct pleasure to welcome you to tonight's program, From Ferguson to Today. This is the third in a series of conversations designed as an opportunity to listen and learn, to be challenged, and to hear differing points of view on important and timely issues. As we have previously discussed, we are living in extremely complex times. Global pandemic, economic uncertainty, extreme political polarization, rampant xenophobia, and a powerful juncture in the battle against racism and racial injustice. The horrific murders of Ahmaud Arbery, Breonna Taylor, and George Floyd have served as a new reckoning of the extensive racism and racial injustice in our country. The Black Lives Matter movement began after the death of Trayvon Martin and Mike Brown, but it is different today. It is more urgent, diverse, and widespread. Our city adopted a resolution declaring racism a public health crisis, and our community has engaged. For example, we have participated in the Maltz Museum's Stop the Hate program, Federation's YWCA's 21-Day Challenge, AJC's work in seeking passage of the No Hate Act, and in forums like tonight's. Historically, there has been a very close relationship between Blacks and Jews, especially during the Civil Rights Movement. Through the years, we have stood together as friends, fighting against bigotry and hatred. We know there is much work still to be done, and there is also much for us to learn and understand, which is why this evening we are pleased to be joined by two distinguished journalists who bring their own unique experience and perspective to this issue. Russ Mitchell is the Emmy Award-winning anchor and managing editor at WKYC TV. Prior to coming to Cleveland, Russ was a national correspondent and anchor at CBS News. There, he was recognized for excellence in journalism, covering some of the most important stories of our time. We are glad he's made Cleveland home. Wes Lowery is currently a correspondent with 60 in 6, a spinoff of CBS News 60 Minutes on the mobile platform Quibi. Wes was the lead reporter of the Washington Post's Pulitzer Prize winning Fatal Force Project. He is also the author of They Can't Kill Us All, Ferguson, Baltimore, and a New Era in America's Racial Justice Movement. Wes is also a graduate of Shaker Heights High School, where he served as the editor of The Shakerite. Welcome home, Wes. Gentlemen, we look forward to your discussion. Before turning over our virtual podium, let me tell our audience that they may submit questions using the Q&A function located at the bottom of your screen. As always, our guests are sharing their own views and do not represent the views or policies of the co-sponsoring organizations. In addition, AJC Cleveland, the Jewish Federation of Cleveland, and the Maltz Museum of Jewish Heritage are all nonpartisan 501c3 organizations who neither support nor oppose candidates. Russ?
Rachel, thank you so much. Appreciate the kind introduction. It is an honor to be here with all of you. And Wes, I'm going to echo what Rachel just said. Welcome home to you.
Thank you.
As Rachel pointed out, you were editor of the Shakerite, the award-winning newspaper at Shaker Heights High School. And I got to tell you, I talked to your former advisor, Natalie Sakicki, a few days ago, and she gave me some insight into you. I'm just going to read something here. I'm going to get your reaction to it. When I said, can you tell me something about Wes that maybe I don't know? Tell me, give me a little tidbit. Quoting here, I do have some memories of Wesley as a brand new, slight freshman journalism student. Quiet, swallowed up by a hoodie, Sporting wire-rimmed glasses and a slouchy baseball hat. He quietly proved to be a capable and reliable reporter and was hired to be a Shakerite editor as a sophomore. By the time he was a junior, he regularly perched in my office doorway after school and confidently engaged me in debates about politics, school policy, achievement, race, gender, you name it. She goes on to say how proud she is of you, but then she says this, which I found very touching, and I think you will as well. She says that Wesley also, when speaking at the City Club for Case Western, for example, and occasionally on Twitter, makes a point of thanking me and mentioning his time at the Shakerite, which makes me cry every time, which I thought was quite a tribute that she could give to you and you could give to her. So I guess my first question to you, again, you're back home in many ways in Shaker Heights. How did growing up in Shaker Heights and your time at the Shakerite shape you as a journalist today?
Certainly. It's a good question. It's fun to think about. I love Natalie. One of the last times I was back home for Cleveland was for her wedding. One of the things I think about, and I say this often, I spend a lot of time talking to student groups, college students, primarily college students, but a fair amount of high school students as well. Interact with a lot of journalism students. And one thing I always tell them is that journalism is in many ways a trade. It's less of an academic profession and more a thing you learn how to do. And that it's so important for them as students to start putting in those repetitions as soon as possible, learning how to write, learning how to interview, learning how to come up with story ideas. And I'm always really grateful and really thankful that I was able to put those repetitions in really, really young. I took Natalie Sikiski's Journalism 101 class as my first period class, my freshman year of high school. It was the literal first class I took at Shaker Heights High School. And it meant that from the first day of high school, I was starting to gain experience in the skill set that I still use every single day today. And the number of times I've done those things help me as I encounter various scenarios. You think about all the things we do as journalists, whether it's learning to interact with powerful people. And we were I spent 4 years going to Shaker Heights Board of Education meetings and city council meetings. And often it was me and two other people in the room. But learning to interact with elected officials, learning to have an accountability to a community. If you write something that gets something wrong about one of your classmates, you're going to hear about it in the locker room or in the hallway, right? If you criticize a program, you might hear about it from the advisor when you run into them by the front door. And so understanding what that looks like, but then also, learning how to build the trust of people whose stories you want to tell, even inside that accountability. And also seeing how the journalism that you do can have impact, seeing small policies get changed at our high school or feel like they got changed because of stuff we were writing about. And so I think all those things were important. Working at a place and working under an advisor with a group of other students. A lot of my friends from the Shakerite are still really close friends of mine today. And so we got to debate and argue and think about what was the best way to cover something and try to understand how national politics factored into our local politics and vice versa. And again, get those crucial experiences writing and editing and reporting. And so much of that I just think is so important. And then I leaned still on a lot of those talents and those skills that I acquired back then or began to acquire back then, even as I did my job.
Was there a magic moment for you, either in high school or before, where you said to yourself, you know what, I want to be a journalist? Was it something that came in waves, or was there a moment that said to you, I want to do this?
I'm not sure that there was a moment. It kind of felt natural. It was kind of this natural progression. It was something I seemed to be good at, I enjoyed. And so then my job was to keep getting good. How do I get good at the newspaper club, right? Like showing up, doing more work, becoming the editor, doing this, and so all of those things I just think were really, really, really important to me. And by the time I was deep into high school, it was a choice in that there didn't seem to be a choice. So there wasn't a choice. This was obviously what I was going to keep doing. This is obviously what I was interested in. In the same way that, I had friends who were remarkable in the performing arts, and we just expected that's what they were going to do. We had friends who were amazing at one thing or the other. This was clearly my niche. It was my thing. And so it was something that was really, really important to me to pursue and
Yeah.
keep pursuing.
Before we get into your amazing career, just one more question about growing up in Shaker Heights. What is, from your experience, what is so unique about this community in your mind?
I think that, look, I think that there are there's the obvious demographic uniqueness that unfortunately, as we live in a society that remains largely by choice relatively racially segregated. Here you have a community that is not the case. In a society that remains largely socioeconomically segregated, here that's not the case. You've got government housing and $4 million historic mansions, in some cases sitting a few blocks away from each other in Shaker. I think that there's something to be said for being in a community of people who value public education, that most people who, especially school-age kids, are choosing to be there for a reason in a way that is different than some other communities. But what I also think is true is that I think Shaker, when it's at its best, which is not always, but when it's at its best, I think that what is true is that it's a place where we are not afraid to argue and debate through these things, right? I think that sometimes people think of diversity and inclusion as unifying and calming things, but in reality, putting a bunch of different people in the same place very often creates chaos. People think different things, they have different backgrounds, they argue, they debate, right? And so the key is finding a way to do that in a way that remains productive. And so again, I think that at its best, it's a place that's not afraid to, tackle difficult issues head on. And I think for me, having now lived in various places across the country, that's not always true. That's not always what happens, and it's not always true inside the public schools as well. And so I just think that that's really, to me, that's a really important part of it.
First job, Boston, right? Or I'm sorry, Los Angeles, right?
So I sandwiched Los Angeles between two Boston stints. I went out and interned in Boston, went to LA for 6 months to work full time, and then came back to Boston full time again. And so every time I'm asked that question, I answer it differently.
Okay. And then the Washington Post, and now, of course, 60 Minutes, I'm quoting 6 on 60. We are in the middle, as Rachel said, a fascinating time in our lives, a time where people are asking questions they have never asked in some cases before, and some questions that we are revisiting. When you and I spoke last week, we talked about how corporate America is dealing with this, holding more diversity sessions, making employees more aware of the diverse nature of the workforce. And a question that comes up, and again, I want to get specific in a minute, but just from what you've seen, what you experienced, are we in a real movement, or is this a moment in your mind?
I think that we are in a movement. I think that that movement can't necessarily be captured just by thinking of this summer. You can't start it with George Floyd, but I think if you push back further enough, whether you get to Ferguson and Eric Gardner in 2014, Trayvon Martin and Jordan Davis in 2012, 2013, I think that there's a period of time that we're looking at, the decade that'll wrap up next year. I think there's unquestionably been a significant shift in our cultural and societal thinking around a lot of these conversations. It shows up in our polling, it shows up in our values, right? We're seeing the types of things that do result in real change, even on policing questions specifically. The detail and specifics of the conversations we're having today were unthinkable 5 years ago. And even as these still remain divisive conversations very often, there's significant movement there. The politics of these issues have changed. And I do think that these steps that people are taking in various different places, be it policing, be it in corporate America, be it in education, those do all add up to something, right? Now, do I think that it culminates in some singular sweeping piece of legislation? I'm not sure about that, but I do think that we've seen for a significant portion of the country a decade here of real grappling with these questions, and in many ways a grappling that is almost now feels almost obvious that would happen. that coming out of the first Black presidency that we would be due for introspection and reckoning about how far had we actually come versus how far do we still have to go.
Mhm. Let's talk about Ferguson and your time on the ground there. Obviously, amazing work there. You were arrested at one point. Scary times. I also imagine being in a situation like that. What did you learn about yourself? What did you learn about the world from that experience?
I think that, it feels so long ago now. Ferguson was 6 years ago, although at times it feels like several lifetimes ago, and other times it feels like it was yesterday. But, there was it was a remarkable story and what I thought was a remarkable moment. I had covered in my previous jobs and iterations, I had covered policing and local politics previously. I'd been out to the scenes of officer-involved shootings or to homicides and been on police ride-alongs. I'd been to protest around these issues. And yet, when I got to Ferguson in Missouri, you could almost tell that something felt environmentally different, that this was gonna, that it had, from the early moments, it had a staying power that I don't know that I had necessarily experienced previously on different kind of parachuting assignments where I drop into somewhere in the nation. And, I think that what Ferguson helps teach us in these moments, and I really do think that that year 14 really starts to pivot this conversation because of two things that are unique to this moment. One being social media, and two being cell phone cameras and the idea of camera, that suddenly a broad swath of a population was seeing things that they otherwise might not have been exposed to. Ferguson is a suburb. You might liken it to Warrensville Heights or Euclid. It was a place that was once predominantly white, and in the years have shifted largely from people coming from the city, from St. Louis, moving out into the suburbs, and then that being accompanied by a round of flight from the people who are already in the suburbs moving further out. And what's often the case in places that change very quickly demographically is that the demographics of the power structure don't change particularly quickly. And so the mayor remains the mayor, the council members remain the council members, except the people they represent have changed drastically. The police chief remains the police chief. But what was true, and what we found through reporting and also through federal investigation, was this was a place that had largely propped up its municipal budget with very aggressive policing practices, from tickets to arrests to warrants. And so you had a population of people that felt and objectively were being preyed upon, and milked for all of the money that they had. And it created such a tension and a dramatics. And I think that for a lot of us, no matter our circumstance, no matter who we are, sometimes we have a very difficult time imagining the depths to which someone else's experience might be different than ours. And so we think, well, the police officer I know would never do that. I would never be treated that way. And so therefore we make assumptions about the person we're seeing on the news or what we're hearing. And I think that at the time, back in 2014, there was, even I think among more liberal spaces or more progressive spaces or more skeptical spaces, I do still think there was some built-in skepticism about the depth and the breadth of the problem. The thought that these must be these individual isolated incidents. There was one bad police officer who had done one bad thing, and that was what was upsetting people. And what I think has shifted and changed over the years, and again, the polling shows us this to be true, is that at the time of Ferguson, Black Americans believed that there were deep systemic structural problems in policing and the law enforcement system and criminal justice. And white Americans largely didn't believe that, including liberal white Americans and progressive white Americans and whomever. And what we see today is that that's shifted drastically, where now video after video after video, hashtag after hashtag, case after case, a larger swath, and in fact, a majority of white Americans now are where the Black Americans always were, which is believing that there is something at the root of these systems that is not working. And this isn't a game of a few individual bad people out there.
The title of your book, 2016 book, They Can't Kill Us All, a provocative title. This title alone, what message did you hope to evoke from that?
So the title, I'll note, is in quotation marks. And so the title comes from, in the book, there's a scene in St. Louis where there was a police shooting that happened after the grand jury decision not to indict Officer Darren Wilson, who'd been involved in the Ferguson case. And it was another shooting. I think this was if I remember correctly now, it's been a few years, the shooting was of a man named Antonio Brown, who'd been shot and killed at a gas station. And in this case, there was some video that showed he potentially pulled a weapon at an officer. It seemed like a shooting that was less questionable than others. And yet it still prompted protest. It still prompted a significant showing in St. Louis. And I think one of the reasons was at that point, the trust had been so singed that it started to demonstrate and show the extent to which, when there are questions, when you don't tell the truth, or you obfuscate, or you allow the trust to be eroded, and when you need it, it's no longer there. And I remember someone setting a sign by a telephone pole, and they had written on cardboard, they can't kill us all. And it captured, in many ways, what I thought, because a lot of this book is about me as a reporter coming into this story, learning the dynamics of these demonstrators and these protests, the young people I was meeting. And it was the first time I'd seen such a sign. And also, it was a sign that captured what I thought was the ethos of a lot of these protests and these demonstrations, was that they felt like this was in many ways, a foregone conclusion in a lot of cases, that these shootings were happening over and over and over again. It didn't seem like there was real progress, and therefore a lot of these folks growing up in these communities, the feeling like any of these people could have been them, but that there were more of them than there were the police or the government. And as they all got together, they all showed up, they could force the government to pay attention and change something. And so pretty early on, I had actually been advocating a different title. I don't even remember what it is now. Pretty early on, my editor and I kind of zeroed in on that line, on that sign, and said, if this is a story about the conception of a movement, in many ways, that was one of the best and most concise expressions of the message being sent by the Ferguson protesters and the protesters elsewhere.
Yeah, I mean, we're all products of our experiences, of course, even, in our writing, reporting, all those kind of things. You were what, 25 years old when you were in Ferguson?
24.
Okay, and you're still a young man, of course.
Don't age me.
Well, no, that'll happen by its own, trust me.
Oh, believe me.
I can tell you that. But being so young in the middle of all this chaos, and you talked about coming into your own as a reporter, taking again, we're all products of our personal experiences, taking what you've experienced prior to that, and just being in the middle of this, was it overwhelming in many ways?
Extremely, in a lot of ways. This was a very different story. The intensity of the emotion in every way, the way it played out in real time on social media, the extent to which the story became hyper-politicized. And, we live in a time, because of our politics, because of our communications methods, where we used to talk about these Rochester tests, right? The ink blot test, where two people would see, and it used to feel like there was a rare occasion where our current events would result in one. But I actually think we live in a moment where basically every news story is an ink blot test, where that in many ways we're so entrenched in our partisan pods, in our pre-existing beliefs, that pick any story can feel cut and dry, much less a story where there is gray area. And you can find two different people who see it completely the opposite. We saw this very recently, not to get into politics or make a political statement. We saw this recently with the president's comments during the debate about condemning white supremacy, where for a lot of folks, What they saw was him being asked, are you willing to condemn white supremacy, and him hemming and hawing, right? Or him even encouraging it. While there were other folks, Republicans, who said the question he was asked is, will you condemn it? And he said, sure, I'll condemn it. And to them, so to them at that point, he had done the thing and everything was immediate gotcha. And there were people, when you look at the transcript, right, you can make an objective argument in either direction. And in many cases, which argument your brain chooses to see and hear is determinant on what you might already believe about the president and his beliefs on these things, or his behavior, or his. And so I say that to say that Ferguson was a story very much like this to a lot of people, where it was the birth of a civil rights movement, and to a whole other set of people where this entire thing was just a massive hoax, and it was made up, and the media is lying, and I think sometimes in the media, when I go back to that story, and one of the stories I don't think I ever did, but if I could go back, would do now, is I do think that sometimes we don't do a good enough job at capturing the backlash. That this was where we had a ton of coverage, some of the conversation about these young activists, these young protesters, what this was looking like. And that's not to say there weren't stories that sought out to tell, the quote unquote police side or Darren Wilson, but the idea that when you look at these same incidents that crystallized or caramelized what we now consider a Black Lives Movement or movement for Black Lives, these same incidents are very radicalizing or kind of scales falling off the eyes moments for a whole other set of people as well, who believe all of it is, the Trayvon Martin death is a hoax, or that it's the media, or and so sometimes we forget the equal and opposite reaction reality, and that I think that at points puts us out of touch of where the country is. We see one side being really mobilized, but we don't necessarily realize the extent to which a whole other set of people are also experiencing this, and that they're also drawing conclusions about their world based on it.
For those who are watching this, want to tell you this in about 10 minutes or so, a little more than 10 minutes. What time is it? 7:29, about 10 minutes or so. We want to go to your questions. So please, when I'll just echo what Rachel said there in the Q&A section, please put your question in there. We'll try to get to as many as we can before 8 o'clock tonight. Wesley, you were 25 years old when you won the Pulitzer. Do I have that right?
Yeah, you got that one.
All right. Okay. What's it like to win a Pulitzer Prize when you're 25 years old?
So look, it's a little. I'd be lying if I said it's not really exciting and amazing. And what I would say is that one of the things I really appreciated then, and I think I even more appreciate now, was I was the younger brother on that team. I pitched the project, but a lot of the heavy lifting was by some of my colleagues who just had put more reps in, knew it a little bit better, were helping teach me. I was learning, right? And I credit the Post and my colleagues there for letting a 24-year-old pitch a big project and going for it, right? But there's something, when we won, for me, since it was still so early in my career, it almost becomes a thing where you go, okay, what's the next one? How do I match this? How do I get back here? But there's something really special also about having that moment and appreciating it when you're doing it with colleagues, some of whom never thought this moment would ever come, might be on the back end of their career. Mm-hmm. There's something really great about working with a group of people for more than a year on a project, and then everyone in that group has the best day of their career on the same day. And what you experience with that, the way that bonds those relationships, the way it helps you forget the times you wanted to kill each other, so that was really that was really important. But I think for me, I have always tried to, as someone who thought in many ways I was fortunate to be on a team that let me do this work and let me contribute to it so young, that identified a good idea I had and helped us run with it. I've always thought that it was important both to myself and to my colleagues to kind of keep that work going in the years since then. And so it's what's the next project? How do we get back to that mountaintop? I remember I used to sit across from a woman named Ann Hull, who is one of the best newspaper feature writers ever, like in American history. She a two-time Pulitzer winner, including for the Walter Reed scandal in the 2000s. But she was a finalist, I want to say 4 or 5 times. So a few votes go a different way, and she's the most award-winning journalist ever. But beautiful, beautiful writer. And we used to sit across from each other, which is kind of an odd pairing, but we became pretty close friends. And I remember on the day we won, She walked up to me. She goes, "Man, you're really only 25? All right, keep going. What's next?" And walked away. And I think that and I think about that sometimes, right? What's the next project? What's the next thing? How do I learn from that project? How do I make it so that that's not the best work I've ever done, and keep going? And so that's part of how I think about it.
From all the information you collected in the data collection project, what's the one bit that surprised you the most?
So
Something you uncovered. So, I didn't see that one coming.
So when I think back about the way we did the Fatal Force Project, and for anyone who might not know the very basics of it, right? This was coming out of Ferguson. We wanted to answer the question of who was being killed by the police. Was it happening all the time? Was it rarely happening? Who were the victims, right? Because at the time, we had protesters, demonstrators in the street saying Black men are being executed in the streets every day, and the police saying, no, they're not. And so we said, well, as journalists, we should be able to figure out which one of those things is true, right? There should be data, there should be statistics. And we found quickly that there was not national data on this. And so we began collecting it ourselves, and we built a real-time database that still exists online. If you search Washington Post Fatal Force, you can see every on-duty fatal police shooting in the country since January 1st, 2015. You can analyze it by demographics. A few things that really stood out to me. The first was how intertwined our police violence is with gun violence. The vast majority of people who are shot and killed by the police are armed with a weapon. Now, in the United States of America, that is not illegal. You are, in fact, allowed to be armed with a weapon. What you're doing with it might change the interaction, but the extent to which many of these shootings across demographics, white people, Black people, others, are the result very often of the presence of a gun and how the availability of the guns factors in. The second was the extent to which mental illness and mental health factored in, where somewhere between 1/3 and 50% of all people killed by the police are in the midst of a mental health crisis at the time of the shooting, and how it speaks to other breakdowns of our societal safety net. Three, the number of police officers who've been involved in multiple fatal shootings over the course of their career. And so we found something like 1 in 8 of the officers involved had previously shot and killed someone. We had teams of police partners who each had 3 or 4. We found a husband and wife pair who I think he'd killed 4 people, she'd killed 3. And so looking at what happens after an officer's involved in an incident like this, and then also, I mean, this didn't surprise me, but it was an important finding, underscoring that yes, these racial disparities did exist, that the demonstrators and protesters weren't making them up. That while it is true that the majority of people killed by the police are white, the majority of people in America are white. Statistically, that makes sense. When you start drilling in, what we found was that, well, Black Americans make up 12% of the population. They make up 24% of the people killed by the police and 40% of the unarmed people killed by the police. So it was raising this additional question of why there was this demographic disparity and what that looked like. And so again, I think from us as journalists, when we started this project, there were police groups, there were others who said the project in and of itself was biased and anti-police, that even the act of counting this data was going to be biased against the police. Today, they all use our data. They send it out in the police union. That at the end of the day, this was a conversation, an extremely important conversation, a conversation about people and their safety and the government's ability to kill them, right? And that conversation has to have facts at the core of it. We have to answer questions. We have to get information. It can't all be anecdote and emotion. And I mean that in both directions, right? There were times where we would find things that would undercut things the police had always believed to be true. There were and so again, I think the more, when we have a complicated, difficult question, the more we can provide precision. And also for us, we live in a show me, not tell me time, where everyone's skeptical, everyone's a journalist or investigator themselves, everyone wants to follow the links and we put all the data online. And so we have people who might disagree with all of our analysis, hate the cases we drill into, but at the end of the day, we uploaded the spreadsheet. You can punch the numbers, you can look at it, and I think for us as journalists, that's the public service we're supposed to be doing.
We're going to go to questions from the audience in a second, but let me ask you, if Ferguson was, as you say, the birth of this, I guess, modern civil rights era, when you look at the landscape now, where are we right now compared to where we were during Ferguson?
I think that I think we're at a crucial point in which we're now at a point where I noted this a little bit earlier, but we're now at a point where the majority of white Americans, who are the most powerful subsection of Americans collectively, because they are the majority of Americans, have the most money, have the most political power, are now sympathetic, if not explicitly supportive of some of the basic ideological tenets of what I think this movement has suggested, which is that there's still systemic and structural racism. It plays out in the systems in ways that devalue the lives of Black people. And once you accept that there are systemic problems, those then call out for systemic solutions, right? I remember I was talking to an activist a week or two ago, and he said, it allows you to realize you can't solve the Flint water crisis by sending water bottles, right? You have to actually fix the crisis. And not that you shouldn't send water bottles, but this idea that civil rights and social justice are not charities, rather they're problems that can be fixed, and then there is no crisis. And so I think that is a crucial moment, that's a crucial point. I think that one of the big questions looking forward is how long that consensus changes. The thing about public opinion is it moves, it changes over time. And just because it moves to a certain threshold doesn't mean it can't go backwards based on current events or things that happen. And so the question becomes, is it possible for some of these structures and systems to be changed in this moment? And also, what does that look like? When we talk about policing specifically, you got 18,000 police departments around the country. There isn't a way to, with one piece of legislation, change all of that. And so it's remarkably complicated, but I do think that these years have really set a tone and have started to craft a understanding for a generation of people who are moving up into business, into leadership positions, who we see this across the political spectrum, that the politics of the millennials and Gen Zs are not, in fact, that different on these issues, even by partisan affiliation. And so that this generation feels a certain way about these questions, and as they ascend, might be able to do something about them.
It's interesting, as a 60-year-old man, I find myself at times being more pessimistic these days than optimistic that things have gotten better and will continue to do so, in the sense that people are aware of the things that we're talking about.
Yeah.
As a 30-year-old man, are you more optimistic or pessimistic that things are going to get better and are getting better?
I mean, look, I think I am part of this might just be as a journalist. I'm a well-trained cynic of everything. I don't really, but I think that sword, right? I don't believe in the inevitability of progress. I don't believe in the idea that it is just going to get better. If we wait long enough, it will all fix itself. I don't believe that to be true. I don't think history suggests that's true. But I do think that on the hyper-specific issues I cover, not necessarily that it's quote unquote getting better. I don't even know that is true. But I do think the conversation has shifted significantly. What we make of that is, in 2014, there was massive public debate about whether or not the phrase Black Lives Matter was racist. We're well beyond that. we're now having good faith in some cases, in other cases not, discussions about if we should defund police departments, right? That is light and day different from 2014 and 2015. And I think that, and the fact that we could even see a case like George Floyd, and there be 80-90% of the country universally condemning, we didn't see that for Walter Scott, an equally egregious video that happened in 2015, right? It was still this, well, we have to find a way to exonerate the officer because, and so I do think that there has been movement, there has been shift. What we make of that is is a whole different measure. But I having been kind of in the trenches on this now for several years, I'd be fooling myself to suggest that it's not dynamically different.
Russ, we're going to go to some questions now. Here's the first one. The media is regularly under attack these days for being fake news. It is hard for the average citizen to know what to believe and hard to find reporting that is neutral. Think MSNBC versus Fox. As a journalist, how has this impacted your work? And do you have suggestions on how one who wants to be able to access well-rounded, factual, accurate news can do so?
I think that's a really excellent question. It's one of the most important questions I of our time, at least in the journalism industry. And I think a few things are true. I think the first is that I mentioned earlier, I think we very much live in a very skeptical show don't tell way, where we no longer believe that the things coming out of the person on television or written in the paper are the word of God, have to be true. We now have a skepticism. A big part of that is because I think of political campaigning that has framed the media as an enemy, as fake. Some of that is that the media gets some stuff wrong sometimes, and that builds a skepticism. That's one of the reasons inside the industry it's extremely important for us to make sure we get things right. As a journalist, I think that for me, it has, one, forced me to try to make sure I'm being as transparent as possible with what I'm producing, what we don't know, not writing around the assumption that I might have made. There's no longer, well, we'll figure out the details tomorrow and update. You know, it's when I hit publish, I want to make sure that I haven't led the reader to believe anything that's not true. Second, I think that, like I said, especially on these big projects, it's how do we allow our readers to see as much as possible? How do we show them, how do we give them the raw data on the police shootings? How do we, so that they can draw their own conclusions? They don't even have to rely on our journalistic conclusion. How do we give them the documents? How do we publish the thing? Because I think perhaps more than ever before, people want that. They want to click through it and see it themselves with their own eyes. I think the third thing is that it, like I said, I think it requires a humility and it requires an engagement. You know, I think social media and the internet have provided readers more means of giving us feedback than ever before. And I think that's important for us when we can to be willing to have those interactions, because it's very easy to make the journalist the villain in your head of whatever happened and not a real person. And there are times where I've, had exchanges with readers who are very upset, who might start with a bunch of vitriol, but by an email or two suddenly have raised a point that was worth me considering. I'm not necessarily saying I would have changed what I did, but where I was better off for having had the conversation. And I think that's important. I think for readers, a huge part of it is, frankly, first of all, supporting local journalism. I think that when we talk about journalism, so much of it's caught up in national politics. That when we think about the media, so much of it's caught up in national politics, and yet I think the most important journalism being done is the journalism being done in the community where you live, holding folks there accountable, documenting our way of life in these places. And we know that local journalism across the country is in crisis. And so subscribing and supporting local outlets, I think, are really important. I think that being engaged and being an active and literate media consumer, watching what we share, we've all hit the button on Facebook and shared something that ends up not being real before. I think that a lot of that falls on us to be smart consumers, and also to be active consumers. And so when your news outlet gets something wrong, let them know. When they get something right, let them know. Right? I think that in many ways democracy gets the media it deserves. and I think that we can, and so I think it falls on all of us to make sure we're getting the media we want.
That phrase fake news is interesting. There was a time when fake news meant deliberate information put out there to change opinion. And right now, fake news is basically with a lot of people. I don't agree with that. Therefore, it's fake news. It's hard to fight that. I
think for a lot of people, it means it's not trustworthy, right? Or that, and I think some of that is based in political preconception, but it's a sense that this is irreconcilably slanted in some way. And I know the news is saying this is this way, but really, if I dig into it, I'm going to find out that it's the opposite. And so therefore, I can disregard it. And I think that and look, I think the president, who has obviously used that language very prominently, and others tapped into, while they took it to all types of lanes, tapped into a real feeling that is important for us to understand as people creating the news. That there are a lot of people out there who have been tricked by a viral headline one too many times, who now bring a level of skepticism to everything we say and everything we report. And I think that that's valuable information for us to have so that we can think about how we try to win those people back.
Let me go to the second question now from one of our audience members. And you touched on this earlier, but What, if any, are the differences between the protests in Ferguson and the protests that we're seeing today?
There are many, many more white people. I don't mean that as like a pejorative in any way. I mean, Ferguson was a very local Black movement. And what we're seeing now is an expanse well beyond that. There's a different diversity in the streets in this moment. I think that there is a different fluency in these issues from the average person who is out there than there was in the early years, right? That protest and demonstration, when organic, are overflows of emotion and righteous indignation. It's not that the Ferguson protester wasn't marching outside with a thesis paper. They were marching outside because there was a teenager dead in the street and they believed it to be wrong. And they wanted to express that and petition their government with that, right? What we're seeing now, 5 years in, is your average person showing up has had 5 years to think about, to debate, to engage on these issues. And so there's often very high level conversation even happening. One of the other things I think is true, though, it's really interesting, having spent a lot of time out at demonstrations, is that protests also very often, there's a component of them, and it's one of the things I find most fascinating, there's a component of them that can be described almost like networking events, where suddenly you have people who live in the same community and share a common cause who've never met each other before, who've never interacted with each other before, who might come from different sides of the tracks or different sides of the community, but they're here today experiencing the same emotions in the same place. And you do see, as you fast forward a year out, 2 years out, 3 years out, 4 years out, things that come of that, relationships that develop, partnerships that develop, organizations that emerge because of the natural, what happens when you collect a bunch of like-minded people in the same place. And so there is, in some ways, a long-term effect that comes of that. There is some person out there in the streets tonight somewhere who 5 years from now is going to be an influential figure, and their first engagement with civic life was that they were upset about a police shooting and went out into the streets this summer, right? And we have no idea who that is. We have no idea what city that's going to be in. We have no idea. But there is something kind of democratically and civically beautiful about that. That I think that sometimes people don't fully grasp.
The third question, I'm going to paraphrase, but I think what this person is asking is, we live in an us versus them society. I call them old man arguments on Facebook. You're not going to change either side's mind, but the watching the conversation is certainly interesting. Have you ever found it through your reporting or through your just discussions with people that you have been able to change minds? Have people read your work, or you've had conversations with people say, I never thought of it that way? Let me take a look at that.
Yes. I think that happens more often with time than it does with immediacy. And so sometimes you write something and people have their initial reaction to it or their thoughts about it, and they come back to it later. Or the world keeps turning and they reconsider the thing they thought about that previously. We've seen, having been on this beat in this coverage area for, at this point, several years, I've written a fair amount of things, and I've seen this summer old work that I've done being reshared or recirculating, people sending me emails about it again, because they were now encountering that work in a new context. And so two different things are true. The first is that I think it's important for us as journalists to think about how do we do work that might move things in the short term, and also how do we do work that is going to prove to be correct and right in the long term, right? That in many ways is among the most important measures, right? That very often providing fair, accurate, truthful coverage, telling the truth at any number of junctures in history wouldn't have made you particularly popular. There have been plenty of people who said, I don't care what you're saying, I'm putting my hands over my ears. I've been able to see, at a small scale at least, any number of times, any number of people, any number of readers and cases where even with just 5 years that have passed, a significant shift on how they're perceiving work. And things that sounded crazy and radical, and how could you frame this way, and how could you ask this question? 3 years out, they go, oh, that was the right question to be asking back then. And so I think that's a big part of it as well. Persuasion is almost never an immediate thing. It's almost always something that takes a little time.
We've got about 2 minutes to go, Wes. So this is the final question from the audience. And again, you touched on this earlier, but it's nice to hear. Nice to get a different perspective on it, or I guess another perspective on it. How has covering these stories affected you personally?
I think that in a lot of ways, I think that they've, one, given me a little bit of a thicker skin, which I think is important and good. Still working on it, but that's part of it. You can't cover big controversial stories without getting all types of feedback, good, bad, and the other. I think it has, I think it's provided me some real clarity on the type of work I enjoy doing the most, which I think is important, which I appreciate. I think that it has forced me to focus more directly on how I balance work and life, and to be out covering traumatic stories and dramatic stories. What do I need when I get home? What does that look like? How do I turn the TV off or close my phone? And that was something that my girlfriend will tell you I'm still working on, but that I am working on. I think that it has been, but also I think that for me, I've been in such close proximity to so many people who've been involved in these stories, whether it be the family members or the activist who suddenly becomes a national figure and then gets canceled and then does this, like that it has really allowed me, and I think journalism does this in general, but it allows me a real close-up look at the human condition in a lot of ways, and the complications and the gray areas. So often we want simple narratives. We want good guys and bad guys, heroes and villains. We want, and watching this story mature and shift over these years has just been a really fascinating experience for me, at least. And I hope has helped me be able to identify the right targets, the right stories, the right ways to keep telling these stories over time.
Still a Cleveland Browns fan?
Ugh. Yeah, the Browns are tough. The Browns are tough, but I still do support.
4-1, my buddy. 4-1.
Yeah, so far we've been down this road so many times that I know far too well to get excited too soon about the Browns. But they're doing pretty well, and I was obviously very happy for LeBron last night, even if it wasn't in a Cavs jersey.
Yeah, in fact, you tweeted LeBron James is the best basketball player ever. That is all, or something like that.
That's it.
You gonna stand by that?
Oh yeah, I just wanted to make people upset. That's what I was going with that one. I am a big LeBron fan. So.
And in the 30 seconds or so we have left to chat, a Pulitzer Prize at 25, 60 minutes. Now, it doesn't get much bigger than that. When you look at your career down the road, where would you like to be?
I want to be. I'm not sure if it's a title. I'm not sure if it's a position. I'm not sure if it's a workplace. But a big part of it for me is getting to tell stories and what that looks like. And so I'm not sure what that means all the way down the road. I'm enjoying this so far, and I want to keep enjoying it. When I stop having fun, I'll switch to something else. But I think that there is, for me, it's always about how do I use whatever God-given gifts I have got, whatever platform I've been given to tell stories, and to tell stories that might not otherwise be told. I used to think this when I was at the Washington Post, but the Washington Post appears on the most powerful desk in the country every day. And I used to think, how do I put a story on that front page that wouldn't have been there otherwise? How do I make, at the time, Barack Obama and John Boehner, and all of them are going to read about this woman in St. Louis or this person in Baltimore, and they wouldn't have otherwise. And how might that change? And so I really believe in the power of storytelling, and I want to keep doing that.
I'm going to go out on a limb here and say, I think you're going to be okay.
I hope.
I hope. I'm sure you will. Professor Lowery, thanks a lot. Hold on for a second. Greg Levine, the chair of the Federation's Community Relations Committee, is going to wrap us up tonight. Right?
Well, thank you both. And Wes, I'm so excited that you're still a Browns fan, and this is our year. We need to make sure the season continues and that we don't have another curse where we're going to win and then something happens that we can't really win. So this is our year. So I want to thank you both for an important and enlightening conversation. Again, my name is Greg Levine, and I have the honor of chairing the Community Relations Committee of the Federation. It's been my privilege to assist in this three-part series of issues impacting our nation alongside our partners at AJC and the Maltz Museum. All three of our organizations are committed to putting an end to hate and bigotry through advocacy and through programs. Tonight we heard about the challenges our society faces when it comes to racial equity. It's incumbent upon all of us to be part of the solution. We live in challenging times, and we cannot turn our backs on societal problems, even if we ourselves do not experience them firsthand. While the Jewish community enjoys a strong relationship with law enforcement, we acknowledge that policing has not always been uniform across communities. While we rely on police to protect our institutions amidst rising anti-Semitism, we also know that policing concerns exist in the Black community. We are committed to maintaining and further building bridges between the Jewish and Black communities in Cleveland. Thank you again to Russ and Wes for assisting us in that journey tonight. As journalists, you both shed light on issues that need our attention, and we hope to be part of the solution. Thanks everyone for joining us, and good night.